these docs have nothing to do with each other. Yeah, that's true. There's no theme I can tie them together with. However, I can tie the theme of the fact that these are all exceptional filmmakers, some of whom I've known for many, many years, actually, but all of whom are very, have made their presence known here at the festival, and I think we're so fortunate to have them all together to talk about the state of nonfiction film and talk about their own films. So I'll have Ric Burns, who is the filmmaker. I'm just going to make sure to get the title of the film right. Oliver Sacks, His Own Life. And you can sit up there, Rick. Ivy Meeropol, whose film Bully, Coward, Victim, The Story of Roy Cohn just premiered, world premiered like 2 hours ago. I don't know, it's like, but Ivy, you can come over here. Any seat. Lynn Novick is the director of College Behind Bars, which premiered yesterday, so please come and join us. All right. And Tania Cypriano is the director of Born to Be, which premiered yesterday and had its second screening today, and I want to thank her and welcome her to the stage. I do joke around a little bit about how the films are not connected, because they're just, I think one of the wonderful things about our Spotlight section is that the nonfiction documentaries, they are very varied in approach, style, and of course in subject matter. So I wanted to just have an opportunity for each of the filmmakers to just talk a little bit about their film, and maybe I would start by asking sort of, Tania, if you could start with sort of, yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. You're fresh from your Q&A. You should be like, woo. But maybe you could just start off by talking a little bit about your film and maybe the impetus for how you got it started, and what inspired you to tell your story.
Well, I actually was approached by the producer, Michelle Hayashi. She had the idea of, she knew this doctor at the center, Mount Sinai, the Center for Transgender Medicine and Surgery, and wanted to see about the possibility of making a documentary. And I allowed me to meet the doctor and get access to people at the hospital. But it took like about a year for us to get the project started. I think both because it was like, her first project, so it was even like, getting her to understand that this was possible. And then secondly, also, getting all the paperwork together to be able to go inside of those spaces. We started with this idea that, let's follow a few of the patients inside of the Transgender Medicine and Surgery Center, following some of the patients to tell the story, what it's about going through surgical transitioning. And by meeting the doctor who gave us access, day two, I was already taken by his passion and commitment to that community, and saw that there was a way of being able to tell this story to a larger audience if I followed him and having him introduce the patients. So we spent like 2 years filming. I was incredibly lucky on the project because I did have a producer that was very successful in raising funds. The film was a huge part done through a private foundation and then private individuals. So for the first time ever in my life, I could make a film the way I wanted to make, because I had access to being able to then hire the cameraman that I wanted to hire and hire the editors that I was able to hire. So, and I hope I never have to go back where I was before. I don't know.
Amen.
Well, this speaks to a larger truth that maybe we could get into later about funding of documentaries and the process that a lot of people have to go through, because so often you start a film and you don't have the funding and you just have to just start it and figure out how to start it. I think you were saying that you bought a camera and that's how you started.
Yeah, we started with a bought camera, but we ended in a good way. Yeah. We started, and so we were there inside of the clinics and surgery rooms for the period of 2 years. We filmed 7 surgeries, most of them historical surgeries in New York City, being the first vaginoplasty, the first phalloplasty, the first surgery, facial feminization surgery that the doctor was doing all by himself, and trying something new. And so it was quite an amazing journey to witness, and and follow 4 patients together with the doctor.
Thank you. And Lynn, you actually, access is a big part of these are 2 institutions trying to shoot in a hospital and a prison. See, things are coming together. These things we're making the connections, but.
Yeah, I mean, I'm resonating a lot of the things that you said. Our film was also following people over time and getting unusual access to film inside medium and maximum security prisons. The producer, Sarah Botstein, and I started talking about the film in 2013. Took us a year to get permission from the Department of Corrections. And our idea was to follow a group of people, men and women in different prisons, who were enrolled in college classes and working toward a degree. And really the film shows through their stories the transformative power of education. And it is a testament to the power of this medium, actually, that the camera can bring you places that the rest we don't usually get to go, meet people you wouldn't otherwise meet, and get to know them very intimately. And if they trust you and feel comfortable, and as time goes on, this came out in our Q&A yesterday, some of the subjects were here saying they didn't trust us at first, they weren't really sure, but over time, and this was a 5-year project, so over time means really quite a long time, revealing more and more of themselves and sharing stories about their pasts and their incarceration and their families and what the experience they're having as high-level college students getting a very excellent education, what that meant to them. That took a long time. So it was over time, this process of discovery, them discovering us discovering them, and kind of collaborating on what the stories would be ultimately.
And you shot it over 5 years. And how long did it take you to edit all of that, Lynn?
So our editor, Trisha Reedy, and her assistant, Chase Horton, worked for 2 years on editing. We had probably 400 hours of material, and we were going to make a feature when we started. And we started with no money and just an idea and a little sort of a grant to shoot for a few days. And when we came back with maybe I would say the first 3 or 4 days of shooting, we edited together a little clip reel to try to raise more money. And we immediately began to think, maybe this is going to be bigger than a feature because the stories are so rich, we're going to follow people over time. So when we had our 400 hours, we sort of assembled the highlights, and that was maybe 10 hours of material. And it was not possible to boil that down to a 90-minute feature. So we ended up with a 4-part series. So, it's the material telling us, and also then had to raise more money and sort of keep the whole machine going longer to sort of do justice to the material that we had collected.
And Rick, you worked with Oliver for a certain amount of time, is that right? Could you talk a little bit about how your process started and the project itself?
Yeah, it was sort of kind of ass backwards necessarily from the start. In that Bonnie, my wife who's here, and I got a call in early January of 2015 from a woman named Kate Edgar, who we didn't know, who turned out to have been working with Oliver for the previous 35 years as an editor and as somebody in the film says, his everything, really, which is true. And the news was, I'd never met Oliver before, that Oliver, who was 81 at the time, had just received, days before, a mortal diagnosis. He'd had an ocular melanoma some 5 or 6 years before, a rare form of cancer, almost never comes back or metastasized. It did, and he had 6 months to live. So would we come in and start filming him? So there was no, it kind of suited my own impulsive nature because there was no need or possibility to do R&D, because Oliver would have been dead. So we just jumped right in within a few weeks and filmed him over the course of the first filming episode was 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, which was very characteristic of anything that Oliver kind of happened around Oliver. It was extreme, it was intensive, it happened on his kind of temporality. It was exhilarating and exhausting and extraordinary. So we started on a Monday and ended on a Friday night, and then followed him on 3 more occasions in April and June of 2015, and then the thing really got him around the neck, and he kind of withdrew from any kind of public circumstance, and died on August 30th, 2015, at just 82. We then interviewed 25 of his closest friends, Tourette's, autistic patients, Temple Grandin, Nobel Prize-winning scientists, Eric Kandel, and for me, the striking thing about it was, of course, like everyone, I had a formed impression, very positive, of Oliver through his written work. I didn't know until Kate Edgar called that he was gay. And I would say that almost no one did. He was a tightly closeted gay man. He had, at 81, just finished a very revealing memoir, which was going to be published by Knopf later in 2015. They advanced the publication date because he would have been dead, as he would have been if it had come out as it was supposed to in September of 2015. He was very, very willing in that book uniquely to grapple with a lot of stuff that had been roiling around for a long time. He had been celibate for 35 years. He had been enormously private, sort of shy to, not a fault, but to an extreme degree, and at the same time, kind of remarkably, sort of almost shockingly open. And so the time anybody spent with him was kind of dealing with these sort of extremes of personality that when I walked in his door, like most, semi-sane people, I instantly worried that he was a massive narcissistic personality disorder. And I didn't freeze, but I had a really strong feeling like, I can't make a film if he's a narcissistic personality disorder, because I don't like narcissistic personality disorders. And it turned out that he wasn't. Was a very extreme person in so many ways, but he had just an extraordinarily childlike, relentless, sometimes self-destructively impulsive desire to understand, to go further, to think deeply, to explore. And the more I got to know him, and then after his death through people who knew him, the more my colleagues and I, many of whom are here, Julie Goldman, Chris Clements, Doug Wilson, David Wilson, we're really struck by what an extraordinary figure he was. Telling the story sort of ass backwards, as I say, sort of at 5 minutes to midnight, an old man talking about, not the fact that he was about to die, though he was not reticent about that, but what the hell does this mean? What's going on? It was just that was the starting point, and what really, I think, was certainly unusual in my experience, to be with somebody who has all his energies intact as he's trying to figure out and impart to others, who am I? What's this whole process about? And pretty soon it'll be over.
Wow, I'm going to come back to that in a second. Ivy, well, you didn't get access to Roy Cohn, but you didn't really want that, did you? Tell us a little bit. I know this is a personal story in a lot of ways, and I think for me it was one of the things that makes it so special is it's told through the lens of a real person whose life has truly been impacted by the life of Roy Cohn. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you got the gumption to do that and figured it out that you could have the strength actually to make this film.
Well, so my film is about Roy Cohn, who crossed paths with my family when one of his first jobs out of law school in the early 1950s was to be an assistant prosecutor in my grandparents' trial. They were on trial they were accused of stealing the secret of the atom bomb and giving it to the Soviet Union. These are my father's parents, and they were executed in 1953. And Roy Cohn had a lot to do with that. We'd explore in the film his role in coaching key witnesses and pushing for their execution, knowing full well that at least my grandmother was innocent and my grandfather really hadn't done what he'd been accused of. So that's kind of what was the starting point. And so this is a person, obviously, that I knew about since I was a kid, really didn't know much more than that. And there are a lot of villains in this story. So there was, the judge and J. Edgar Hoover and et cetera. So I but what happened is that in 1988, I was with my father in Washington, D.C., and we visited the AIDS Memorial Quilt, which was, if any of you have heard of it or remember it, it was a massive exhibition of tens of thousands of panels, actually, of people who died of AIDS, and it was a very moving exhibit. And we could have walked into any point onto the mall but the first panel we saw was Roy Cohn. Someone had made a panel for Cohn. I didn't know he was gay. I didn't know he had died of AIDS. And I thought, no, and this is the guy who, in 1953, had been, pushed for my grandparents' execution. So I thought, well, this is a fascinating figure that stuck with me for a long, long time. And for years, I thought about making a film about him because of this fascinating, the interest in this secret life that he led and how that might have created the person that, how that contributed to him being this kind of, this vicious, anti-communist, anti-gay himself person. So, but then Donald Trump was elected, and I thought, well, Cohn was Donald Trump's mentor, lawyer, and good friend. And I thought, well, this is really the time to do this. And if I'm ever going to finally make this film, this is what I think all of us have, lots of projects that we think about for years, and you think, oh, am I going to do it? Am I going to do it? And to answer your question more directly, Leslie, it's very hard sometimes to decide to use yourself and your family and your personal story in a film. I've done it once before, and I thought I was never going to do it again. And I had actually kind of vowed not to do this again. But sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes there's an urgency to it, and sometimes you can't. Sometimes the story doesn't let go of you, and that's kind of what happened to me. It was a convergence of all those things, and I really felt compelled that when we finally decided, I got to do this.
Was there anything about making the film that surprised you? Anything that you discovered, or in yourself even, as a filmmaker, aside from anything you might have thought of or may have discovered about the topic or the person?
Well, I think I found that I had more empathy for Cohn than I ever could have imagined. I always sought to look beyond the kind of, just calling him evil and just thinking of him that way, because you can't make a whole film about someone and just have this kind of one-note thing. But I didn't really think that I would have gotten to the point of having, but then it was more complicated than that. It's like, I don't forgive him, but I see him as, that's why our title is borrowed from the quilt itself, Bully, Coward, Victim. But he's not just a victim because he died of AIDS, he's a victim because he was a closeted gay man who, you look at footage and photographs of him at periods of time in his life when he was happy, and then you see how he really became this, miserable, angry, malevolent force. And I really believe that a lot of that came from the fact that he buried so much. He was so afraid. So I actually have empathy for that, and that he experienced that. Not how he used it, not how it came out of him, but so that did surprise me, especially given how much he really had he did a horrible thing and affected my family forever.
Well, it's amazing that you could even think about it in that context, because that's a tribute to you as a person, as a filmmaker, that you could even get to that point, to be fair to you, because I don't know. It's tough. Your subject matter is somebody that you don't like, that is difficult to be. Yeah. And then in this context, your film really is about that, whereas your film is about a very beloved person. And that's just as challenging in some ways, right?
But closeted for much of his life.
See how I'm making these connections? Just want to get a little credit for that. But no, but yeah, it's just as challenging to me to think about making a film about someone that's beloved as it is to make something about a film that someone is maybe universally or more or less universally hated.
I'll just jump in to say that I think what makes any film worth watching is that even if you love someone or you hate them, if through the artistry of the filmmaking you see that they're complicated, and that you can feel more than one way about someone. And if it's a one-dimensional this person's terrible, or this is a saint, or whatever. It's sort of not, ultimately you get that in the first 5 minutes. And I think it sounds, I mean, I can't wait to see both of your films, but that's what will make them, I'm sure, so enduring, because we're all complicated. None of us are that simple. And I think if we see ourselves in that, that's what makes documentary in a way so powerful.
I think that speaks to the subjects of your film as well. This is, you get to know all of these folks in a much deeper way and have a real clear understanding, even when you find out maybe why they're in prison or what they might have done. But you've humanized them to a point where you can really understand. I think the hook of education is a fascinating one. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think for Sarah and me and for our whole team, we were very convinced in the beginning of our project that we were going to have our audience go through the same journey we went through, in a sense of getting to know people. And so many times you see films or read articles or in the media, anyone who has a criminal record or is incarcerated, the first thing you find out about them is their record. So-and-so murdered this person, or so-and-so, that is the identifying information, is their conviction. And which of us wants to be known by the worst thing we've done and have that be the label that's just on your chest, no matter who you are? So we felt, as filmmakers, we would get to know people, and we didn't ask them you can look it up if you want. For anyone who's in New York State prison, you can get some basic information about their conviction. But we really didn't look into it until we got to know people well. And then we slowly said, do you want to talk about this? And if you do, how do you, in what way? And, you don't have to. Obviously, it's your choice, but I think ultimately all the incarcerated students that we got to know wanted to tell their story. And those stories are complicated, and nobody sugarcoats or kind of lets themselves off the hook. And so people reckoning with and confronting their own complicated past is partly, they would say, and they did say yesterday, the effect of the liberal arts education they've gotten through Bard College helped them to understand who they were and why they did what they did, and how to move, forward in a productive way. So it's, I think the complexity is what makes us all lean in.
Tania, you had to go through a process too of getting to know subjects of your film and getting them to be open to this very, very, very personal matter that you're delving into. I'm wondering what that process was like with you in terms of getting to know the subjects.
Yes, I think, just to go back a little bit, because as I was being introduced, I got introduced to a lot of patients. We were there, what would happen is that, especially in the clinics, we would go in the morning, and the day before, 2 days before, they would already be told that there was going to be a camera there. And the process of meeting people and seeing who we followed was it took a while. It was we were there, they would tell that we were there with the camera, who wanted to be filmed or not. But to be in those spaces where you also have to make a decision, okay, are we really going to follow this person? We would see it sometimes 20 people in one day, And but I found that during this, for me, the one thing that I discovered was, and I find that it has happened also in other works, is that you go there to make one film and really to be open to see, to see that character and the story that maybe is not the person you're looking for. Like in this case, it was the doctor. It took a long time to convince the doctor to be in the film. And I found out, not only I was talking about, the relationship that he had with his patients was so special, but from my second day there, I found out that he was a musician, and that he was actually trained as a musician first, and that he wishes to this day to be a musician. His family, when he finished the school at Juilliard, and he was actually like a master at what he did, but the family asked him to go back to school and do something he could make money. And he had a brother who was already a doctor that convinced him to go to med school. So here you have a man who, this is the story that I thought, let me follow. This is a man that he wishes he was a musician and he couldn't be. And what does he do today is he helps people be who they want to be. And in this case, I tried then to find the characters that spoke about the diversity of this community, although I'll never get there because it's just endless, the people that and the types of lives and backgrounds. But also very, very important, and the most, and it's still difficult to this day, is that of making the relationships with the subjects. A lot of them do not have families, do not have friends. They live very lonely lives. And where I literally had to, like, still to this day, like, be that family for them while making the film. And but as I hope people see when they watch the film, is that they do see the intimacy of the spaces that I'm allowed to and how much they are comfortable with giving. There were some patients that would say, can you please show my body, not show my face? I made sure from the very beginning that I did not want to, that I would only follow people that were comfortable saying their name and showing their faces. And this is also a stylistic thing, because I do not, like, for me it's very important that these people are open and to talk about who they are and their experiences. And then it was making that connection where they felt very comfortable about us being, I mean, I don't know how many people here got to see the film, but we're in really tight little spaces. And you're going to go to a doctor's clinic. They're very small, very small. The camera is there, and it's all about body parts. And I mean, it was really tough, like, to be able to get everybody to be on that comfort level. But I think that also what allowed is that another process that I used during the filming is that I talked a lot. I mean, Jeffrey Johnson, who was the cinematographer, I had worked on other projects with him, and I made sure that before we went there that he knew what we were getting. And a lot of times I would just let him alone in the room. I would not be inside of the room. So that's, I think, another way that people felt very comfortable with reading. I don't know if that answered.
No, it did. Well, it answered that and other questions.
Okay.
So that was good.
Sorry.
Well, no, I mean, I think you do have to see the film to understand the intimacy of what is depicted and what you were able to capture, and that, to me, is extraordinary part of it from the perspective of the access, but the subjects who were open, and I think that is what makes your film extraordinary in the way that you're able to show us a world that we don't know. And that leads me to thinking to Lynn about your film, because I think in that way it also, we're being allowed to see something that most of us don't know about, right? It's just a world it's an institution within an institution. So, and you had full access to that school within both of these prisons, and I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that. And I just wanted to make one other point, just to say that you've been making mostly historical films, so historical documentaries. If you don't know who Lynn Novick is, Google her tonight when you get home. But this is a verite film, really, and it's a bit of a departure from stylistically. And I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Just to say, so when I first started out in this world, I was an intern, and Lesli was my boss. She was the PA at WNET. And then I went from there to work for Ken Burns and his brother Ric Burns, who were working on the Civil War series that came out in 1990. And from then worked many years on historical pieces, like Lesli said. So this was a very different project. And it's really great to be here with all of you for all those reasons. But our first day of shooting, really, Sarah and I felt that, this was an extraordinary opportunity because the camera can bring you to places that you don't, the rest of us, unless you've been incarcerated or have a very close family member who's been incarcerated. These are purposefully walled off places that the rest of society does not see and is not allowed to see and doesn't have access to. And our film was not specifically about what is it like to be incarcerated, but what is it like to be in college while incarcerated. So we started off mostly with access on the school floor of the prisons that we were in, and over time we were able to convince the Department of Corrections to let us see more and more, because by showing just the students in class, you sort of forget where they are after a while. And so early screenings, people said, this is really interesting. They're studying Plato, they're studying Shakespeare, they're studying algebra, Mandarin, very advanced topics, but you kind of forget that anyone's in prison here. So we asked to be able to film people in their cells. And I think those moments are some of the most intimate, very small spaces. And you see how people organize their living space with their schoolwork and their personal, whatever they have, and what they do or don't put on the wall. And, you know, just this, it could be very intrusive, but I think it was actually very collaborative, that the students wanted us to see and wanted the world to see how they live and manage being students and incarcerated at the same time. And it's actually, you kind of have to see it visually to really appreciate. So I could tell you about it, but it doesn't really compute until you see the footage. And we had that experience over and over again making the film, that it felt like such a privilege to work on a film like this, because it was sort of, there isn't really any way to explain the story unless the camera could help you see it. And our cinematographers, Buddy Squires, who many of us have worked with, and Nadia Hallgren, were so energized by the process of being able to bring the cameras to these places, that they would basically say, next time you have a shoot, make sure you invite me. I don't want to miss a single opportunity to be there. So there was something very special about being able to be present for these very revelatory experiences.
You know, I want to say about Lynn's film, which I haven't seen the whole thing, but was privileged to see parts of it in construction, and most recently about a year ago, about a half an hour opening. You know, I mean, we're all working with the same material. It's like, you know, we have cameras, you know, they're either it's either cinema verite, or it's photographs or archival footage, or they're interviews or whatever. So, the palette is extremely narrow. There are only a few things to do. There's no way to really reinvent the wheel, except what I'm really amazed by is in this film, which I hope all of you can see, is that there's this extraordinary quality where you're looking at these men and women. I've actually only seen footage of the men.
And there are women as well, yes.
And what you can feel looking at the film frame, there's this remarkable stillness of the way the film is looking at them, or just letting you listen and look at them, and an incredible tension, and you feel so much every nanosecond. They're in this world where you're not, and you're here. And that makes all the difference in the world. And it's not stressful, it's sort of almost exhilaratingly focuses your attention. So it's really, I'm really amazed that, and I'm sure in your film and your film as well, there are ways in which there are micro innovations within documentary filmmaking, because it can't always be the same. It has to address its subject in a new way, and that in this film, I know it does. So just anybody who's interested in how film progresses, see these films, because they're really steps forward.
That's a really excellent point. And Rick, I'm thinking about your style as well, because I don't know if I've seen a film of yours that doesn't have narration.
Yeah, I mean, it is, we made a film about American Ballet Theater, which was all interviews, but this was really different in that there isn't a narrator. There's like 25 talkaholics, but including Oliver preeminently, or everyone. But what our film is about is really something invisible too. But it's more sort of universally invisible. It's like, what is it to be a person inside your own head? I mean, Lesli, there you are, occupying this space, but you're the only one who's looking out at your eyes. That's the universal condition of us all. It's sort of banal to say that, but it's the kind of foundational reality in which all of us live alone and together. Yeah. And Oliver was somebody who, as an atheist, English, Jew, homosexual, found himself wondering his whole life. Everybody in his family was a doctor, mom and dad, 2 of his 3 older brothers, except his closest older brother, Michael, who was schizophrenic. So Oliver, as the sort of the baby prodigal, was always sort of going, who am I? What am I? And between the schizophrenia of his brother, which he always worried he was as well, and the sense that it was the family duty to become a doctor, he used his complicated intersection of complete idiosyncrasy and sort of clinical doctorly responsibility to ask this question, who am I, by asking of other people, who are you? And not just any other people. People often who couldn't speak. People who were in coma or seemed to be in coma. People who were seriously, seriously compromised. And what he wanted to do at a time when certainly neurobiology and neuroscience was remarkably quantitative. It was like what you could measure and what you could see. And he wanted to get at this thing that you can't measure and you can't see. He wanted the qualitative data of finding out who these people were, as a way of also, in some sense, interrogating himself, who am I? And that, I would say, lifelong obsession was like all, I think, really, really gifted people. Something in them gives an order, and I don't want to say uniformity, but a coherence and an insistent vector to their life that most of us don't have. Most of us live happily, in a more multifarious way. And then there are some among us, and Oliver was certainly one of those people, who was compelled to live this life constantly asking that kind of question. And so that kind of funny, that's where moviegoers are. They're sitting in the dark, looking out, having experiences on the inside about what they see and hear. So in a way, Oliver was a moviegoer or a storyteller. And the stories and movies he wanted to tell were stories and movies about very, very unusual people, and he wanted to not judge them, and he wanted to make sure that you understood we were all just as irreducibly idiosyncratic as any of these people who maybe on the surface seemed more obviously so. So there's this tremendous kind of the joy of Oliver's work, which is I think what all readers found, or many readers find in his work, is his sense of kind of, on the one hand, yes, he's looking at these cases of remarkable, and fortunately, relatively rare idiosyncrasy. People who have brain lesions and people who were sort of in coma or seemed to be for 40 years from encephalitis lethargica, which they'd had in the 20s and had been warehoused. I mean, so what was going on in those people? Who's in there? And that sense in which what he's doing, he's creating a new kind of universal humanistic database in which the data is not quantitative, the data is the qualitative aspect of what it's like to be a person in any way. And what a remarkable kind of lifelong obsessive compulsive quest to have.
That's just a tip of the iceberg, is what I'm trying to say. And I hope you'll see, this film is remarkable, and I think you're exactly right, because it's really about who we are. And film is so interesting this way because there is a point of view, because a camera's being pointed at somebody, and someone's made a choice about where that camera's going to be pointed. And so
yeah, I always find so interesting, and sometimes in Q&As, people say, "I noticed that you were showing this image when someone was talking. Was that intentional?" I'm sure, and I think actually because of what we do, everything has to be intentional. And we make 1,000 decisions for every 1 minute of film. Everything is intentional. So what we're pointing the camera at and where we're making the edit point and what you're going to hear, and if there's sound effects or music it's just a million decisions to create something that hopefully doesn't feel intentional. So I can't wait to see the film.
And that makes me think, Ivy, about the enormous amount of archival and other material you have. What did you find that transformed your film? Was there a moment, was there a piece of archival tape or video or something that just made you think differently or made the film take a different direction?
Well, yeah, our film is packed with archival footage and stills, and most remarkably for us and for me, I think, was the audio tapes that we got. So to be able to have, since we didn't have, I didn't have Roy Cohn to talk to as you had Oliver, and nor maybe would I have wanted to, I don't know. But to have him almost narrating his own story, and in a way, because the tapes that we initially got a hold of, which really was what sent me to the point of saying, okay, now we really are going to make this film, because having that material that no one had ever heard, and there's only so far I was going to be able to go with my own story. I wanted us to understand Cohn, so to hear him talking about his own life is pretty amazing, it's kind of a naturalistic, conversational tone that we have him in with a reporter. It's not a formal interview, so that makes it even better. So that was one. Later, after we'd been in production for a while, and I was looking for tapes everywhere. People would tell me, "Oh, I talked to him for hours and I recorded it, but can't find the tapes. Can't find the tape." We became obsessed with. There are tapes out there. If anyone finds them,
We're gonna get them now.
We're gonna get them now.
Tell you, yeah.
But pretty far along in the process, I interviewed a woman named Lois Romano, who was a journalist at the Washington Post, who cultivated Cohn as a source and also had interviewed Trump and has some great stories and great things to contribute to the film. But she, after I'd interviewed her, she called and said, "I found my tapes." And those tapes turned out to be even better than the ones we had. I shouldn't say better, but added something that I'd never thought we would have, which is the sound of his voice as he's extremely ill and he's towards the end of his life. And he's reflecting a little, somewhat, as much as he was capable of, possibly. And I find they were just so powerful to hear. And so to me, that was a great surprise and gift to get at the end. And then we also, even later in the process, got access to a private archive of Cohn's personal photos, which showed these Polaroids of him enjoying his life in Provincetown, where he lived Provincetown, Massachusetts, which is a well-known gay community in the summer especially. And he would go there and get to live the life that he wished he had been able to live, I believe. So these Polaroids that we were able to, at the very last minute, swap out stills that we had initially had was just, we couldn't believe the luck. And
Julie Goldman is shaking her head in agreement.
It was during the color correct, yeah. I'm not even telling. We were in the color correct, actually saying, "Oh, we could swap that one out for that, and that one out for that." It was like Christmas morning with Polaroids.
Have you all seen Capturing the Friedmans? Do you remember that film? That film, I don't know if you know, but famously they didn't have the home movies for that film until they were editing like a year into the film. And then suddenly someone said, "Oh yeah, we have these home movies." Like, oh, the whole movie is based on these home, if you go back and watch it now, imagine it without the home movies that are in it. But they were well into the editing process before someone said, "Oh yeah, by the way, would you like to look at these home movies?" So we have a few more minutes left, about 10 minutes, and I just thought I would throw it out to this group here and make sure if anyone had any questions. This is not the time to be shy. But look, people are shy. Yes. Oh, wait for the microphone. Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, we're recording. I should have known that, but I didn't.
Hi, thanks. My question is directed to Ken Burns.
He's not here.
It's Ric Burns.
Who?
Ric Burns,
Oh,
not
Ric
Ken.
Burns.
But that's all right.
I just picked up Lawrence Weschler's book on Oliver Sacks, and I'm only 70 pages into it. And yes, Oliver Sacks is an original. There's no one like him. Talk about being educated. He could have any discipline. Just briefly, one thing Oliver Sacks said was, with all the doctors in the family, he chose neurology. And they said, "Well, you could have been a cardiologist." And Oliver said, "A cardiologist and deal with the heart? It's a pump." It's a fabulous book. I can't wait to see your film.
It is a fabulous book, Lawrence Weschler. And Who Are You, Dr. Sacks? And How Are You, Dr. Sacks is the sort of unusual title. And Ren Weschler, as he's known to his friends, came to Oliver very, very early. Oliver's first couple books, he wrote a book about migraine, which went nowhere, and he wrote the book Awakenings, which gained sort of retrospective notoriety when the movie was made about it in 1990. But when it came out in 73, like 73 people read it. And it was respectfully reviewed, but really went nowhere. And Ren Weschler in the late 1970s found Oliver. He'd unusually read Awakenings, and he just started working at the New Yorker. And he went up to this warehouse hospital in the Bronx, Beth Abraham, where he had been dealing with patients. and got to know Oliver, and was at a time when Oliver was, miserably blocked on his third book, A Leg to Stand On, which took him 10 years to write.
I love both of your films, by the way. My question is for you. What neighborhood were you in?
Where is the microphone? Who is that? Oh, there it is. Did somebody just... That was weird, right? Was that like from another theater? Like
From another.
Yeah.
Oh, from somewhere.
In any case, I want to say Ren is featured in our film and is a remarkable kind of reporter and raconteur about Oliver's inner life, as you know from his book. Wow, that was Ken, by the way.
Okay, so that was not me.
There's a real person
Yes,
speaking here.
right. That was not me. I disclaim. So I was curious, especially in the prison and then a little in the hospital, about the technical choice about what camera and scale of camera and blah 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 and how many people and.
I can quickly talk. So we had two cinematographers principally, Nadia Holgren and Betty Squires, and they use different cameras. So Betty used the Amira, which is an extraordinary camera in every kind of light, and the images are just stunning, stunning, stunning. And it's a bigger operation. Nadia used the C300, which is much smaller, and she carried it on her chest, basically. And they're both actually rather small people, don't take up a lot of space. But navigating the camera in these small spaces was challenging. And one of the students was saying yesterday, and they've talked about this before, that for them, people need, when you're incarcerated, your personal space is very important, and anyone encroaching on it can be challenging. So they had to learn to get comfortable with the camera. Giovanni was saying, Buddy was right up next to me, and I was just, that was hard to get used to. But I think both cinematographers, in their different ways, just made the students feel comfortable.
But going in, did you have concerns that the presence, in your mind, were you kind of like...
Does the camera change
did
anything?
The school, well, of course it does, but did the school setting just relax everything so you felt like, or did you kind of feel like you still wanted to have something that was more subtle to not...
I'm not sure I actually understand the question, but...
You're literally getting that.
Yeah, no, I know. One of the things that happened was just everybody who was being filmed had to get comfortable being filmed. I think that's true in any film, any process. And I think we did a lot of shooting, actually, that we ended up realizing, we're probably not going to use that, but it was actually really great, even though it was expensive, to bring our camera crews here for a day, just so people can get comfortable with what we're doing. So that happened a lot. And otherwise, I don't think the process is probably that different from any other documentary, except in the sense that we had to get all of our equipment into a correctional facility and out, and every single item had to be checked on the way in and on the way out, and you had to have a gear list, and if anything that you brought wasn't on that gear list, it had to go back to the car, and if you didn't have everything on the way out, it was very serious. So that, everyone had to get used to that level of security, and it took a little while, and occasionally some things, it got complicated occasionally, nothing too serious, but someone would realize they had brought something they shouldn't have, had to run back to the car and that kind of thing. But it just was a layer of attention to the process that, kept everyone very focused.
Yep, there's a question back here, in the back here.
Just wait for the mic to come back.
Thank you.
I don't know what your name, but the filmmaker who made the film about transsexual, what attracted you to that subject?
I think as I said, the story came to me, but what attracted me most is that I had already done 3 different films about, specifically on health and HIV/AIDS, and those films had traveled a lot to LGBTQ film festivals. I did not know anything about transgenders, and when I started to hear about it, how can I know so much about this community and not know really about it? I think it was really of finding out about how little I know as I walked into that world. Another thing is also the same, it's a topic that actually Michelle brought up earlier today, finding out the percentage of people that try to commit suicide in that specific community. It's like it's like 48%, which is the highest of suicide rates. I mean, like of attempt suicide rate, and I could not believe when I heard. So that was, I think those two were the things. I think it's very important that we are curious, not the word that we want, it's very important that we try to learn things that we don't know.
Amen to that.
Yes.
We have time for one more question here? Okay, we'll do two. How's that? Okay, start there. We'll come over to you.
Ivy, you talked about your family and not wanting to do something involved with your family again. Can you talk about that? And then just in general, protecting the people that you are interviewing for documentaries, to all of you.
Oh, sure. Well, I guess what I meant is that it's very hard to put your family out there and be kind of utilized in the service of a story that's going to be out. I mean, it's not. I don't. Because I had done it once before too. I made a film called Heir to an Execution many years ago, where I dealt with this story, and it was about what happened to my family. And I had thought that I had moved on from that. And I am a filmmaker who's interested in many stories, and to revisit something that's so personal and painful, I didn't jump at the chance to do that. Let's put it that way. But I felt that it was important to use that story again to help tell this one, and to use it in a specific way. So I think that's all it was. It was more of like, okay, how can I use this to help tell the story of Roy Cohn and help people understand what happened, what he did, how he operated, and how he justified these things to himself, and how that resonates today. I mean, just the other day, Donald Trump said, threateningly about the whistleblower, that you remember what we used to do to spies, and he's talking about my grandparents. He's saying, like, basically, we will kill you. I believe that's what he's saying. And so we have to. This is a history that many people don't know. Even people my generation don't know the story, and I think it's important, even more important now. So in that sense, you feel compelled. I felt compelled to use my family, but it's not an. I guess what I was trying to say is that that's not an easy thing for me as a filmmaker, or probably for anyone, to bring their family into that story, because it's painful. And what the other part of your question? I'm sorry. The question is protecting the people who we are interviewing. Yeah, that's a big part of what we all do. I think probably even more when it's stories like what Tania and Lynn are doing, but even Ric, because he had some a person available. I interviewed people about Cohn, and it's always trust. There's always an establishment of trust, whatever story you're doing. They're putting themselves in our hands, and they're saying, okay, we're gonna film all this, and I can do a 3-hour interview with someone and use 2 minutes, and they don't know what 2 minutes I'm going to use.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Janet Malcolm is famous, the great New Yorker writer, famous for saying at the beginning of a piece that she wrote called "The Journalist and the Murderer," that, as every honest reporter knows, each time out you betray your subject. I want to say that the gig that we're in, is exactly the opposite of that. You're being given this unusual opportunity to do exactly that. And therefore, you have to double and triple down on not betraying your subject. And it's, I think, the most kind of complex and moral aspect of the work that we do, which is to in some sense, not let somebody be more revealing than they want to be themselves. And you would sort of go like, well, why wouldn't you do that? You have them in front of the camera, they've signed their release. But I'll tell you, you can see in a film and spot something's fishy here when the filmmakers have not been, in an almost parental and exacting way, absolutely there doing what Ivy just said. You're trusting us, and so we will not fuck you over. Even if you're Roy Cohn.
This is
No, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, like in our film, nudity was a big thing, and I mean, even though all the characters allowed us to be inside of those rooms, and they knew the camera was all over. When and should I show, and how much should they show? And for me, that part was a very, very difficult thing in this film, as far as trying to protect them. And it's not because they're giving the okay for me to film everything that I need to show you. And talking about where to put the camera, actually a huge part of the film was made in the editing room with reframing. We reframed so many of the shots that are in the film. And the only times that, then it was a very difficult choice to make, but I thought they were important, but there are only 2 times in the film that we do show nudity. It was specifically because that nudity took you to a narrative, a place in the narrative that was important. But and the same thing I'm thinking about, one character who's a sex worker that we had, the interviews, the stuff that she told us, there was so much material that was there that she did, but that we could have used because it was funny, nobody had done that before. But, also being very careful of how I portray this woman out there, because she doesn't know where she's falling inside of the so I think it's something that you have to be super, super careful, because those people are trusting you and all that. So the access, even though you have it, it doesn't mean you need to use it in full. You know what I mean? That's the way I see it.
I just want to thank you for the question, because it really goes to the heart of what we all do in such a deep way, which is, people trust us in one way or another to be vulnerable and to open themselves up in front of the camera. And it's personal to each of us and to our teams that they are going to do that. And so, and they might reveal themselves in ways that are not appealing, or that are, something that might be sorry they said, or, that kind of thing. But I think what the core that you hold on to is that whatever you do is with integrity, and that if someone's being honest and showing a part of themselves, that, an audience might not love them for that, but it's part of the story, and you understand why they're doing it, they understand, then there's sort of that's okay. And if you're sort of, the process isn't open, it's very hard to explain, it's very subtle, but if there is sort of a line, and if you cross it, you're sort of taking something from someone, and it's very extractive and exploitative, that doesn't feel like what we want to be doing up here, I don't think, for myself and for everyone I've worked with. So, and it's not, there's no hard and fast rule, but I think what Rick said is exactly right. You have the opportunity to portray your subject at every turn, if that's what you want to do. But you might not ever make another film. Although there are filmmakers who do that and have very successful doing it. No, there are. That's like a different kind of thing, but if you want to get at some authentic, deep human truths, then you can't do it like operating that way.
And that's why documentaries are the best. We are out of time, I'm afraid, but I do want to thank everyone here, and I encourage you all to please seek out these filmmakers, learn about them and their films, and if you want to see more documentaries, please check out our website and find out what our screening schedule is. But thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank
Thank you, Leslie.